Hold him! Keep him down! Press your weight! No!
The depth is right. The slurry is cleared. Good. Proceed with caution.
Before sterile surgical suites, stainless steel scalpels, and synthetic anesthetics, humanity survived on the razor's edge of immediate, unyielding physical survival. Long before the earliest cuneiform marks were pressed into clay, before the first pyramids cast their shadows across the desert sands, a broken femur or a shattered joint was a death sentence. To be immobilized in the Paleolithic world was to be discarded by the relentless pace of the pack, to freeze in the damp shadows of a limestone cavern, or to be torn apart by opportunistic scavengers. Yet across distant continents and vast millennia, early humans unlocked survival strategies carved not from books or formal academia, but out of raw instinct, ruthless trial, acute observation, and incredible physical resilience. To step back into this ancient world is to witness medicine at its most primal and terrifying. A visceral, unvarnished dance between agonizing physical agony, desperate human innovation, and the shocking regenerative power of natural healing. Imagine a late autumn evening on the wind-swept steppe. The air is heavy with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and rendering animal fat. A hunting party stumbles back toward the perimeter of the clan's shelter, their voices ragged and hollow with panic. Dragged between two burly kin on an improvised litter of woven saplings and matted bison hides is one of the band's primary trackers. During the pursuit of a herd along a treacherous shale ridge, a loose ledge had collapsed, casting him down a 40-foot embankment of jagged rock and frozen detritus. The injury is catastrophic. His right thigh is swollen to nearly twice its normal girth, purple-black hematomas already blooming beneath the skin like dark flowers of trauma. The limb lies bent at a grotesque, impossible angle, rotated outward with the jagged, sharp crest of the broken femur pressing violently against the inner surface of the skin, threatening to rupture through the flesh into an open, fatal wound. The patient is in a state of profound, cascading neurological shock. His skin is pale, cold, and coated in a sheen of viscous, frigid sweat. His breathing comes in rapid, shallow gasps that rattle in his chest like dry leaves, and his eyes, wide, bloodshot, and dilated with sheer, unadulterated terror, dart wildly between the faces of his kin. Every slight bump of the ground, every inadvertent shift of his hips sends a blinding, white-hot lightning bolt through his central nervous system, forcing gut-wrenching, animalistic shrieks that ring out across the twilight and echo against the surrounding cliff faces. The pain is not merely a sensation, it is an all-consuming fire that suffocates his consciousness, turning his world into a narrow, agonizing void where only fear and agony exist. The camp immediately erupts into tense activity. Children are hustled toward the back of the cave shelter, away from the horrific sight, while the clan's elder healer steps forward into the dim circle of firelight. This individual carries no modern credentials or sterilized instruments, but rather decades of hard-won knowledge etched into memory. Knowledge gathered from butchered game, observing wild animals repair their own broken limbs, and surviving decades of relentless wilderness living. The healer moves with a quiet, practiced gravity, kneeling beside the writhing man to lay calloused, filth-ingrained hands upon the burning, swollen flesh of the shattered thigh. The patient violently flinches at the touch, a guttural sob tearing from his throat. His knuckles turn stark white, his fingers digging so deeply into the frozen dirt of the camp floor that blood begins to bead beneath his fingernails. He knows what must happen next, and that knowledge brings a second wave of primal dread. Before the physical manipulation can begin, The healer attempts to offer whatever meager chemical comfort the surrounding landscape provides. From a leather pouch suspended at the waist, the healer pulls a handful of dried, crushed willow bark, rich in salicin, nature's crude precursor to modern aspirin, mixed with pulverized poppy seeds and a bitter, sticky resin scraped from pine trees. The mixture is forced into the patient's mouth. The hunter chews frantically, driven by instinct, swallowing the dry, astringent paste with dry gulps. Yet, while these botanical compounds might dull a lingering toothache or soothe a mild fever, they are entirely useless against the overwhelming, monstrous agony of a displaced, compound-adjacent fracture. They are a drop of water cast into a raging volcano. The healer realizes there is no time to wait. The massive, powerful muscles of the human thigh, the quadriceps and hamstrings, are already entering violent, uncontrollable spasms, contracting like iron bands and pulling the broken, sharp bone ends past one another, tearing through deep muscle tissue and internal blood vessels. If the bone is not brought back into alignment immediately, the trapped swelling will cut off circulation to the lower leg, or the sharp bone fragments will sever the femoral artery, leading to internal hemorrhage within hours. The healer barks sharp orders to 3 of the clan's strongest hunters. The men position themselves instantly, their faces set in a grim, unyielding mask. 2 of them throw their full body weight across the screaming patient's upper torso and shoulders, pinning his thrashing arms to the earth with massive forearms. The 3rd grips the patient's healthy left leg, anchoring his hips down to prevent his body from sliding across the ground. The patient realizes the procedure is beginning. His chest heaves in violent, desperate spasms, his throat raw from screaming. His eyes roll back into his head, tears carving pale rivers through the soot and mud cacked upon his cheeks as he braces for an agony beyond human comprehension. The healer takes position at the base of the shattered leg, wrapping both hands tightly around the patient's ankle and calf. The plan is brutally simple, yet anatomically precise. Manual traction. The healer must apply immense, continuous physical force to pull the ankle downward, stretching the spasming thigh muscles until the overlapping bone ends clear each other and can be guided back to end-to-end contact. Pull, the healer growls. The healer leans back with full body weight, driving feet into the dirt for leverage, pulling the patient's leg with agonizing slowness. The reaction from the patient is immediate and catastrophic. A scream erupts from his throat, a sound so primal, shrill, and saturated with agony that it sounds entirely non-human. His back arches off the earth with terrifying force, his abdominal muscles contracting into iron ridges as he fights against the 3 men holding him down. His heart hammers against his ribs at a terrifying pace, blood rushing to his face as the pressure in his skull spikes. The pain of the pulling force stretching the torn muscle fibers and dragging the jagged bone ends against nerve-rich periosteum is an absolute, overwhelming nightmare. The healer does not hesitate, ignoring the horrifying cries and the desperate writhing of the man beneath him. With a final, explosive surge of strength, the healer applies an immense manual torque to the lower leg while using a knee to press hard against the bulging side of the broken thigh. A sickening, deep, dull crunch resonates through the patient's entire skeleton, a wet, grinding vibration of living bone against living bone that everyone standing in the circle can hear and feel through the earth beneath their feet. The bone ends snap back into line. At that exact instant, the patient's body goes tirely rigid. His jaw locks hard, his teeth grate together, a final muffled roar dying in his chest before his central nervous system, utterly overwhelmed by the electrical storm of pain signals, simply shuts down. His head snaps back into the dirt, his eyelids flutter, and he collapses into profound, unconscious shock. Though the scream has ceased, the healer's work is only half finished. An aligned bone will instantly misalign the moment traction is released if it is not rigidly immobilized. The healer immediately signals to the gatherers, who bring forward the carefully prepared materials for prehistoric splinting: thick, straight strips of green ash wood, supple hazel saplings, sheets of pliable dried birch bark, and long ribbons of fresh, moist animal rawhide soaked in warm water and river mud. With swift, practiced motions, the healer places the flexible birch bark around the patient's thigh to distribute pressure evenly and protect the delicate skin from pressure sores. Next, the rigid wooden splints are positioned along the inner and outer aspects of the entire leg, extending from above the hip joint all the way down past the ankle to ensure complete joint immobilization above and below the fracture site. Then comes the critical mechanical trick of prehistoric cast making: the rawhide binding. The healer wraps the damp, heavy hide strips around the splints in tight, overlapping spirals, pulling each turn as taut as humanly possible. As these wet rawhide thongs dry over the coming hours near the warmth of the hearth fire, the protein fibers within the animal skin will shrink dramatically, pulling the wooden splints together with tremendous, uniform compressive force. By morning, the damp wrapping will have transformed into a rock-hard, unyielding exoskeleton, a primitive cast that locks the femur in rigid, immovable alignment. As the moon reaches its zenith, the unconscious hunter is moved closer to the hearth fire, wrapped in thick bear pelts to combat the deep hypothermia of traumatic shock. His breathing remains shallow and ragged, his body occasionally twitching with involuntary muscular spasms as his brain continues to process the echoes of the trauma. In the weeks that follow, the camp becomes a sanctuary of slow recovery. While the rest of the clan hunts and gathers, the patient is cared for meticulously, fed bone marrow broths, herbal infusions to combat inflammation, and fresh meat to provide the heavy proteins needed for tissue repair. Beneath the hard, shrink-wrapped rawhide cast, a silent biological miracle takes place. Undifferentiated cells within the deep layers of the periosteum transform into osteoblasts, laying down a soft, fibrous mesh of collagen across the fractured gap. Over weeks, this soft matrix absorbs calcium and phosphate, transforming into a dense, bony callus that bridges the broken ends together. Months later, when the dried rawhide is finally sliced away with a razor-sharp flint flake, the hunter's leg is scarred, stiff, and noticeably shortened by a fraction of an inch. Yet, the bone is solid. He tentatively places his weight upon the ground, leaning heavily on a carved wooden staff, his eyes filling with quiet, weary triumph. He can stand. He can walk. In a brutal, unforgiving wilderness where a broken bone was meant to be a grave, human hands, primal wisdom, and raw endurance had snatched a life back from the brink of absolute oblivion. When it came to open flesh wounds, ancient humans faced an adversary far more insidious and relentless than a fractured limb: the invisible, creeping death of bacterial infection. In an era long before microscopic biology was understood, a minor scrape from a thorny vine could fester into red-streaked sepsis, and a deep laceration from a hunted beast was almost certainly a drawn-out, agonizing death sentence. Without sterile irrigation or synthetic antibiotics, the prehistoric fight against open trauma was a brutal battle against time, decay, and blood loss. The remedies employed were not gentle, they were violently effective, forged at the crossroads of raw thermal destruction and the surprising biochemical secrets of nature: fire and flora. Picture a seasoned hunter dragged into the flickering illumination of the clan's camp by his frantic companions. During an encounter with a massive wild boar deep within the thorn-choked thickets, the beast had charged, driving a jagged, curve-shaped tusk straight through the tender muscle tissue of his upper forearm. The resulting laceration is horrific, a wide, gaping tear stretching from his wrist nearly to the crook of his elbow, exposing raw red muscle fibers, pale yellow connective fascia, and the glinting sheath of exposed tendons. Dark, crimson venous blood pools rapidly into his palm, dripping steadily into the dry, thirsty dirt beneath his feet. The immediate shock of the tearing impact quickly gives way to a sickening, throbbing heat. The patient's face is slick with a cold, greasy sweat, his lips turned a dull, pale blue. His chest heaves in rapid, shallow spasms, his heart hammering against his ribs like a panicked, trapped bird. Every pulse of his racing heart sends fresh rivulets of warm blood spilling over the edges of the jagged wound. He clutches his injured forearm to his chest with his healthy hand, trembling violently, his eyes wide and vacant as his brain struggles to register the sheer volume of tissue trauma. He knows the danger of the deep wound. He has seen others in his tribe wither away days after similar injuries, their skin turning black and foul-smelling as a terrible burning fever consumed their minds. The clan's healer acts with practiced, urgent precision. In this primitive environment, stopping the hemorrhage and preventing the inevitable invasion of microscopic rot requires extreme, unhesitating measures. The healer barks sharp commands to two young hunters, who immediately force the wounded man down onto a fallen, moss-covered log. They pin his body down with unyielding strength, one pinning his shoulders to the timber, the other locking his good arm and legs in place to counteract the violent thrashing that is sure to follow. Beside the central hearth fire, a flat slate stone and several rounded river cobbles have been resting directly inside the white-hot heart of the embers for over an hour. They glow with a pale, menacing red warmth, radiating a wave of intense thermal energy that bakes the surrounding air. The patient watches the stone being prepared, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror as his breathing accelerates into an erratic, hyperventilating pant. His body knows what is coming, and every natural instinct within him screams to break free and flee into the darkness of the woods. Before the iron discipline of fire is applied, the healer attempts to dull the edge of the impending shock. Reaching into a suspended leather pouch, the healer pulls out a moist, pungent mass of crushed willow bark mixed with the bitter sap of wild poplars, botanical remedies rich in naturally occurring salicin. The healer forcefully wedges the fibrous, dripping wad of bark into the patient's mouth, commanding him to bite down. The hunter clamps his jaws on the wooden fibers, his teeth grinding together in desperate, helpless anticipation. Using two sturdy green wood tongs wrapped in wet river moss to prevent them from catching fire, the healer reaches into the embers and lifts a red-hot slate stone from the coals. Smoke rises from the charred wood of the tongs as the stone is carried through the dusk toward the pinned patient. "Hold him," the healer grunts softly, locking eyes with those holding the man down. The healer aligns the flat, glowing edge of the stone directly over the gaping, blood-filled tear in the forearm. Without a second's hesitation, the red-hot stone is pressed directly into the exposed, torn flesh. The physical reaction from the patient is instantaneous and utterly terrifying. A horrific sizzle of scorching tissue, rendering subcutaneous fat and boiling blood fills the quiet campsite, accompanied immediately by a thick, acrid plume of gray smoke that carries the sickening stench of burning meat. The patient's entire body violently contorts in an explosive, involuntary muscular spasm. His spine arches with such terrifying force that his spine pops against the fallen log, his legs kicking wildly into the air as he fights against his restraints with superhuman strength born of pure agony. His muscles strain until the tendons in his neck stand out like taut ropes. A sound tears from his throat, a high-pitched, agonizing shriek that bypasses human speech entirely, echoing the raw, unbridled pain of a dying animal. The willow bark in his mouth is crushed into splinters between his clenching jaws, blood mixing with the bitter botanical juices slipping down his chin. Within seconds, his voice cracks under the strain, his vocal cords giving out entirely, leaving him gasping in silent, shuddering shocks of pure agony as his eyes roll back into his skull. Yet, despite the horror of the application, the thermal intervention worked with absolute, uncompromising perfection. The intense heat instantly cooks the proteins within the severed blood vessels, searing them closed in a fraction of a second and halting the life-threatening hemorrhage completely. Furthermore, the extreme temperature creates a totally sterile, charred boundary zone across the entire surface of the wound, destroying any bacteria, dirt, or organic debris that had been introduced into the flesh by the boar's filthy tusk. When the stone is finally lifted away, the gaping laceration has been transformed into a dry, black, cauterized crater. The patient slumps limply against the fallen log, his breathing coming in ragged, whistling wheezes, his consciousness teetering on the edge of a deep, trauma-induced blackout. Now that the immediate threats of bleeding out and immediate bacterial introduction have been contained, the second phase of prehistoric wound care begins: long-term healing and protection against opportunistic infection. From a sealed clay pot wrapped in oiled leather, the healer scoops out a thick golden paste, raw, unpasteurized forest honey gathered from wild hives, blended with dried powdered sphagnum moss and fine gray wood ash from the hearth. This primitive poultice is a brilliant masterpiece of natural chemistry. The raw honey, laden with high sugar content and almost entirely devoid of free moisture, works through intense osmotic pressure, drawing water out of any invading bacterial cells and effectively dehydrating them before they can divide. Furthermore, as the honey slowly reacts with the fluids of the body, it releases tiny, sustained traces of natural hydrogen peroxide, creating a hostile environment for harmful microbes without damaging the fragile, recovering human tissue underneath. The healer spreads the cool golden paste thick across the charred surface of the forearm, providing the patient with a faint, soothing relief against the lingering, radiant burn pain. The powdered sphagnum moss acts as a sterile, highly absorbent dressing, soaking up excess exudate while providing a soft matrix for new skin cells to crawl across. Finally, the healer wraps the entire forearm in clean, softened strips of deer hide, securing the poultice tightly against the arm. In the days that follow, the healer watches the wound like a hawk. In some cases, despite the fire and honey, pockets of dead, oxygen-starved tissue deep within a laceration would begin to rot, a condition known as necrosis. In these dire scenarios, ancient healers employed a surprising living biological weapon: blowfly larvae. If dark, foul-smelling patches appeared within the wound, the healer would deliberately collect blowfly eggs from the forest floor and introduce the freshly hatched maggots directly into the dead tissue. These tiny, pale creatures possessed a remarkable biological precision. They produced digestive enzymes that dissolved only dead, decaying human tissue, leaving healthy, living human tissue completely untouched. As the larva fed,
they systematically cleansed the deep recesses of the wound of necrotic rot, secreting antibacterial compounds that further sanitized the injury. Once the living red wound bed was cleared of dead material, the healer would gently wash the larvae away with fresh spring water and reapply fresh honey and moss dressings. Over weeks of quiet rest by the hearth, the patient's body performs its slow, remarkable rebuilding process. The black, charred scab produced by the initial fire cauterization slowly loosens and sloughs away, revealing a bright pink layer of fresh granulation tissue beneath. Fibroblasts weave new networks of collagen across the gap, while tiny capillaries sprout to carry oxygen and nutrients to the healing margin. Though the hunter would forever bear a thick, ropey, shiny scar across his forearm, a permanent souvenir of his encounter with the boar and the burning stone, the function of his hand and arm remained intact. He had survived the searing iron of primitive surgery and the microscopic threats of the wild, standing as a living monument to the ferocious resilience of the human body and the raw, effective brilliance of ancient survival medicine. Of all the crude and visceral interventions undertaken by prehistoric humanity, none reached the breathtaking heights of daring, agony, and raw anatomical intuition like the ancient art of trepanation. Long before the invention of the electric cranial drill, the sterile drape, or modern neurosurgical mapping, early healers ventured directly into the sacred vault of the human body, the skull. To open a living human head was to step directly onto the razor-thin boundary separating life from immediate, fatal neurological collapse. Yet across Neolithic Europe, the high Andes of South America, and the ancient steppes of Asia, primitive societies routinely performed this astonishing surgery to relieve crushing intracranial pressure, extract shattered bone fragments from combat trauma, or banish the agonizing demons of intractable seizures and maddening cranial pain. Picture a mountain trail high in a mist-shrouded valley. A territorial dispute between neighboring clans has devolved into a chaotic exchange of heavy wooden clubs and hurled river stones. A young warrior, swinging a heavy hardwood bludgeon, is struck full on the side of his head by a jagged quartz projectile. The force of the impact is devastating, delivering a shockwave that rattles his brain within its bony casing. He drops instantly to his knees, his weapon slipping from his lifeless fingers before collapsing sideways into the mud. His comrades drag his limp body back to the shelter of their rock overhang camp. He is alive, but his state is perilous. Blood trickles steadily from a star-shaped tear in his scalp over his right temple. His breathing is slow, heavy, and stertorous, a deep rasping snore that signals profound brainstem distress. His left pupil is wide and totally unresponsive to light, blown open by the rapidly expanding pocket of blood, an epidural hematoma trapped beneath his skull, which is relentlessly crushing the delicate, soft tissue of his cerebral cortex against the rigid inner wall of his bone. Without immediate mechanical decompression, the rising pressure within his cranium will force his brainstem down into the base of his skull, extinguishing his heartbeat and breathing within hours. The healer kneels beside the unconscious warrior, placing a thumb gently over the swollen, boggy region above the right ear. Beneath the torn scalp, the healer feels the ominous, soft depression of a fractured, depressed skull fragment pressing inward. The healer knows that no herbal tea, no chant, and no surface poultice can save this man. The pressure inside his head must be released. Bone must be cut. The preparation is swift and merciless. The warrior is laid flat on a slab of raised granite, his head supported by a hollowed-out wooden block to keep it rigid. 4 strong hunters take their positions, gripping his shoulders, forearms, chest, and legs. Even in his semi-comatose state, the human central nervous system will react violently to the excruciating trauma about to be inflicted upon his head, requiring absolute, unyielding physical restraint. The healer pulls a leather roll from a braided hide pouch, revealing the tools of this prehistoric neurosurgery. A handful of razor-sharp, hand-napped flint flakes, a curved obsidian scalpel capable of cutting with microscopic precision,
a small bone scraper carved from antler, and a collection of coarse river stones for grinding. There is no ether, no twilight sedation, no local numbing agent. The only
Hold
preparation
fast.
offered is a piece of
Press
dried
down.
leather placed between
No,
his
please.
jaw to prevent him
Brace
from
him.
biting his tongue
Hold him
off during the
still.
procedure. The
There,
healer
put this
begins by
between his
sweeping
teeth.
aside the warrior's dark, blood-matted hair, shaving the
please
area
wake
above the
up.
temple using a sharp flint blade moistened with water. With the bare skin exposed, the healer takes the curved obsidian scalpel and makes a bold, deep, crucial incision, a cross-shaped cut straight down to the bone. The reaction from the patient is immediate and involuntary. Though semi-conscious, the rich network of sensory nerves weaving through his scalp sends a massive electrical cascade directly to his spinal cord. His entire body twitches violently against the hands holding him down. A deep, guttural moan rises from his chest, rattling against the leather wedge clenched between his teeth. Bright arterial blood erupts from the severed scalp vessels, pouring over his ear and down his jaw in a warm, steady stream. The healer ignores the blood, using the antler scraper to peel back the 4 flaps of flesh, exposing the pale, glistening surface of the skull, the periosteum. The healer meticulously scrapes away this fibrous outer membrane, exposing the raw, yellow-white surface of the cranium beneath. The damaged, fractured plate of bone is now fully visible, surrounding a small hairline crack where the trapped blood is oozing outward under immense, unnatural pressure. Now begins the most horrifying and grueling phase of the surgery, the manual cutting of the bone. The healer selects a heavily serrated flake of dark flint and places its jagged edge directly against the living skull. With steady, rhythmic, and tremendous downward pressure, the healer begins to draw the stone blade back and forth across the bone. Scritch, rasp, scritch, rasp. The sound is horrifying beyond description. Because the human inner ear is embedded directly within the temporal bone of the skull, every vibration of the flint grinding through the bone is conducted directly into the patient's auditory system. The sound does not merely enter his ears from the air, it echoes violently inside his mind, an excruciating, bone-deep rasping that feels as if his very consciousness is being scraped away. As the blade cuts through the hard outer table of the skull, the warrior awakens into a nightmare of pure agony. His eyes snap open, bloodshot and frantic with an instinctual primal terror. Tears stream uncontrollably down his temples, mixing with the dark pool of blood coating his cheeks and jaw. He thrashes his torso with terrifying strength, his spine arching off the stone slab as he attempts to pull his head away from the grinding blade. The men holding him down groan under the strain, driving their weight into his joints, pinning his skull firmly against the hollowed wooden block. The patient's vocal cords strain against the leather bit, producing a muffled, high-pitched screech of unadulterated suffering. Every stroke of the flint blade sends shockwaves through his central nervous system. His skin turns a mottled, ghostly pale, slick with cold sweat, as his body teeters on the fine line between agony and total cardiovascular collapse. The healer remains utterly unbothered by the screaming and the blood, focused entirely on the tactile feedback of the stone tool. The healer cuts 4 interconnecting grooves around the fractured region, creating a rough circular ring of weakened bone about the size of a large coin. The work requires immense precision and delicate control. If the flint blade slips or presses too deeply through the inner table of the skull, it will plunge directly into the delicate, highly vascular dura mater membrane or slice into the soft brain tissue beneath, causing instant paralysis, massive stroke, or fatal hemorrhage. Scritch, rasp, scritch, rasp. The stone tool cuts deeper, reaching the spongy vascular middle layer of the skull, known as the diploe. Dark red blood begins to seep up through the groove, mixing with the white bone dust created by the friction. The healer periodically pauses to wipe away the slurry of blood and bone dust with a damp tuft of moss, checking the depth of the trench along every millimeter of its circumference. After nearly an hour of continuous, grueling manual labor, the flint tool finally penetrates the inner table of the bone. The healer feels the sudden, subtle give of the material. The circular plug of skull, the trepan, is almost completely detached, suspended now only by tiny, thin bridges of bone. Setting the flint blade aside, the healer selects a small chisel-like wedge carved from hard mountain oak. The healer gently places the tip of the wooden wedge into the groove and applies a light, controlled tap using the palm of the hand. Pop. The sound is sharp and distinct. The circular piece of bone snaps free from its moorings. Using a pair of bone tweezers, the healer carefully lifts the detached plug of skull away from the head, exposing the dark, tight duramatter underneath. The mechanical transformation that follows is instantaneous and miraculous. The trapped, high-pressure hematota, a thick clot of dark purple blood that had been violently compressing the motor cortex and brainstem, squirts outward through the newly created opening, relieved of its prison. The sudden release of intracranial pressure allows the compressed brain tissue to expand back into its natural position. Instantly, the warrior's violent thrashing ceases. The terrifying, asymmetrical distortion of his face relaxes. His jagged, frantic breathing slows, deepening into a steady, rhythmic cadence as his brainstem is freed from the crushing force above. His blown left pupil rapidly contracts back to its normal size, matching the right. The blinding, horrific noise inside his head fades away, replaced by the quiet rustle of the wind through the surrounding tree.
The warrior drops his head back onto the wooden support, his eyelids fluttering closed. He is no longer screaming in agony. He has slipped into a deep, peaceful, restorative sleep, a state of true rest made possible by the mechanical relief of his brain. With the pressure relieved and the shattered bone fragments safely removed, the healer moves to dress the cranial vault. The exposed duramatter is washed with clear, cold spring water to remove any remaining bone dust or debris. To prevent infection and protect the vulnerable opening, the healer applies a smooth layer of antibacterial resin gathered from spruce trees, blended with clean animal tallow and powdered clay. A small, carefully shaped disc of dried gored or beaten silver, in civilizations that possessed metals, is placed over the hole to serve as an external shield, secured beneath the flaps of the scalp. Finally, the cross-shaped scalp flaps are folded back over the site. Using a needle fashioned from a fine bird bone and threads spun from dried animal sinew, the healer stitches the scalp closed with neat, tight sutures. The wound is bound tightly with clean, soft hide to prevent swelling. Over the coming months, as the warrior recovers his strength and learns to walk again, his body performs an astounding feat of skeletal remodeling. Though the circular hole in his skull will never fully close with solid bone, the living margins of the cut cranium begin to round it off. Specialized cells coat the exposed edges, smoothing the rough flint-scraped stone marks into polished, continuous bone. Archaeological digs across the globe have uncovered thousands of ancient skulls bearing these distinct, rounded openings, irrefutable physical proof that these prehistoric patients did not merely survive the brutal, unmedicated trauma of the surgery itself, but lived for years and often decades afterward. These primitive interventions were horrific, bloody, and soaked in screams of absolute agony. They pushed the human body to the absolute limits of physical endurance. Yet beneath the terror and the blood lay a profound, beautiful truth. Even in the dim dawn of human history, driven by nothing more than love for their kin and a relentless desire to survive, early humans possessed the ingenuity, courage, and biological instinct to reach into the dark, fight against death, and perform medical miracles long before the modern world ever awoke.